The security alarm blared through Starbase Argus, a heavily guarded human station on the edge of known space. Captain Elias Vance, a decorated officer of the Earth Interstellar Fleet, had just returned from a patrol mission. He was looking forward to some rest, maybe even a quiet meal. But peace never lasted long in the galaxy. His comm device buzzed urgently. "Captain Vance, you need to come to the main hangar. Now." It was Lieutenant Hayes, his second in command. Her voice was tense, almost shaken. That was unusual. Hayes never lost her composure. Vance frowned. "What's going on?" An unknown alien warrior just walked through our defenses like they were nothing. No weapons fired. No alarms triggered until she was inside. "She's demanding to speak to you." Vance's steps quickened. An intruder. Demanding to see him. It didn't make sense. When he reached the hangar, the sight before him made him stop in his tracks. A tall alien warrior stood at the center of the room, surrounded by armed guards. She was unlike any species he had seen before. Her deep blue skin was marked with silver battle scars, and her piercing violet eyes scanned the room with sharp intelligence. She wore an ornate golden-brown combat suit, its surface etched with strange symbols. But what caught Vance's attention most was the small figure standing beside her. A boy, no older than 7 or 8, clung to her hand. He had short, dark hair, his skin a mix of human warmth and alien blue. His wide eyes looked up at Vance, not with fear, but with curiosity. Before Vance could ask anything, the alien warrior spoke. "Captain Elias Vance," she said, her voice deep and commanding. "Meet your son." The room fell silent. Vance blinked, his mind racing. His son. That was impossible. He had never seen this woman before. Never met anyone of her species. Never. He took a step forward, staring at the boy. The child looked back at him, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" Vance finally asked, his voice steady but cautious. The warrior lifted her chin. "I am General Jaira of the Kavar Dominion." Kavar. The name sent a chill down Vance's spine. The Kavar were one of humanity's greatest enemies, a warrior species who had clashed with Earth's forces in multiple wars. They were ruthless, skilled, and nearly impossible to defeat in close combat. "What kind of trick is this?" Vance demanded. "I don't know you. I don't have a son." Jaira exhaled sharply, her violet eyes narrowing. "You do." She placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "His name is Rael. He is your child, born from your blood." Vance shook his head. "That's not possible. I was never with." Jaira cut him off. Not by choice. Her voice was firm, but held something else, something close to regret. "You were taken, Captain. Years ago, during the war." His breath caught in his throat. He had been captured once, 6 years ago. His ship had been ambushed near the Kavar border. He and his crew were prisoners for a month before the fleet rescued them. He had been wounded, interrogated, but nothing more. At least that's what he had believed. Jaira continued, her tone unwavering. "Your DNA was taken, used for a Kavar experiment." She glanced at Rael. "He was never meant to exist. The High Council of my people has ordered his death." The words struck like a hammer. Vance looked at the boy again. A child. A living, breathing child, hunted by his own people. His people. His son. Rael remained silent, his gaze shifting between the two adults. He looked neither afraid nor confused. Just waiting. Vance took a deep breath. "Why bring him here? Why bring him to me?" Jaira's expression softened for the first time. "Because I refuse to let them kill him." Her grip on Rael's shoulder tightened protectively. "He is more than just Kavar, more than human. He is the future, and I will not let them erase him." Vance's heart pounded. His instincts screamed at him that this was a trap, that he was being pulled into something far bigger than he could imagine. But then he looked at Rael again, at the way the boy watched, dim, measured him, as if waiting for him to decide. One truth was clear. This child was his responsibility now. And the galaxy would not let him go without a fight. Captain Elias Vance stood in silence, his mind racing. The boy, Rael, stared at him, waiting for something. But what? A father's embrace, recognition, acceptance. Vance didn't know how to feel. His whole life had been about duty, war, and survival. And now, standing before him was a child. A child he never knew existed, who was somehow his own. He turned his gaze to General Jayara, the Kivar warrior who had just shattered his reality. "This doesn't make sense," Vance said, shaking his head. "Why would your people use human DNA? The Kivar hate us." Jayara's face remained emotionless. "Because they feared you." Vance narrowed his eyes. "Feared us." Jayara nodded. "Humanity is different. You are weaker than us physically, but you are unpredictable, adaptable. In war, you refuse to surrender, even when logic says you should." The High Council wanted to understand that. So they experimented. They wanted to create a hybrid, a warrior with Kivar strength and human resilience. Her eyes darkened, but the experiment failed. Vance's stomach tightened. He glanced at the boy again. Failed how? Jayara hesitated. For the first time, she looked almost uncertain. "The High Council expected a weapon," she said quietly. "But Rael is something else. He is not just Kivar or human. He is both, and that terrifies them." She knelt beside the boy, resting a protective hand on his shoulder. They ordered him to be destroyed the moment he was born. Vance clenched his fists. He had fought the Kivar in battle, seen their ruthless ways. But to kill a child, an innocent child, simply because he was different. He felt a cold anger rising inside him. Jayara continued, "I was the one assigned to eliminate him, but I couldn't." Her voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "For years, I have hidden him, but I cannot keep running. The Council's assassins will never stop hunting him." Vance's mind spun with the weight of her words. A Kivar general, one of their strongest warriors, had betrayed her own people to save this child. Rael, his son. The boy had been watching him the whole time, silent, studying him. And then, for the first time, he spoke. "Are you really my father?" Rael's voice was soft, uncertain. Vance exhaled slowly. He didn't know what to say. How could he? He had never asked for this, never expected it. He wasn't a father. He was a soldier. But looking into the boy's eyes, his eyes, reflected in a strange, alien way, he knew the truth. "Yes," Vance said finally. "I am." Rael blinked, then he nodded, as if accepting something he had already known. Jayara stood up. "I brought him to you because I have no other choice," she said. "You are the only one who can protect him now." Vance ran a hand through his short brown hair. "And what do you expect me to do? I have a duty to the fleet. I can't just disappear with a child." Jayara's jaw tightened. "Your fleet will not protect him. If they find out what he is, they will see him as a threat, just like the Kivar do." Vance hated that she might be right. The interstellar fleet wasn't known for taking chances. A half-Kivar child, especially one with unknown potential, would never be allowed to live a normal life. Vance sighed. "What do you expect me to do?" Jayara's gaze was steady. "Take him. Teach him. Keep him safe." She paused, then added, "He is stronger than he looks, and he will only grow stronger." Vance studied the boy. Rael stood still, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his stance, a quiet discipline, a sharpness in his gaze. Not just a child, a warrior in the making. Before he could answer, the base alarm blared to life again. "AMTURUDR 8 alert." A voice crackled over the comm system. "Captain Vance, we have Kivar warships inbound. 5 of them, coming in fast." Jayara's face hardened. "They found us." Vance cursed under his breath. Of course they had. If Jaira had smuggled Rail out, the Kavar would have been tracking her every move. He tapped his comm. Scramble all fighters. Get the defense shields up. But Hayes' voice came through, tense and urgent. Sir, they're not attacking. They're transmitting a message. Vance frowned. Patch it through. A deep guttural voice echoed through the hangar speakers. Return the child, or be destroyed. Silence filled the room. Vance turned to Jaira. They won't let him live. She shook her head. No, they won't. Vance looked at Rail again. The boy wasn't afraid. He stood tall, his small hands clenched into fists. He knew what was at stake. Vance took a deep breath. This wasn't just about orders anymore. This wasn't just about war. This was about protecting his son. He activated his comm. Lieutenant Hayes, get my ship ready. Sir, Hayes sounded confused. Are you leaving? Vance's jaw tightened. We're not giving the boy up. A beat of silence. Then Hayes answered, her voice steady. Aye, sir. The Kavar warships loomed closer outside the station. Vance looked at Jaira. You better be ready to fight. A small smile flickered on her lips. I was born ready. And with that, the battle for Rail's life began. The red emergency lights flashed across Starbase Argus, casting long shadows in the hangar. The air was thick with tension as Captain Elias Vance watched the Kavar warships closing in through the station's reinforced viewport. Return the child, or be destroyed. The alien demand echoed through the comms, but Vance had already made his decision. He wasn't going to surrender Rail. Not now. Not ever. He turned to General Jaira, who stood calmly beside him, her battle-scarred face unreadable. How long before they attack? Vance asked. Jaira didn't hesitate. A few minutes at most. The Kavar do not bluff. Vance tapped his comm. Lieutenant Hayes, status. Hayes' voice came through, tense but controlled. Our defense shields are up, but they won't hold against 5 warships. If we engage, we'll be outgunned. Vance exhaled sharply. The Kavar were not sending a warning force. They were sending an execution squad. They had come to erase Rail, and if Vance stood in the way, they would erase him too. He turned to Jaira. How do we survive this? Jaira's violet eyes met his. We run. Vance's instincts rebelled against the idea. Running wasn't in his nature, but deep down, he knew she was right. Starbase Argus wasn't equipped for a full-scale battle against Kavar warships. If they stayed, they would die. And worse, Rail would be captured. Vance looked at the boy. Rail stood between them, silent but alert. His small hands clenched into fists, his sharp gaze flickering between his father and his mother. Rail, Vance said, kneeling to his level. We're leaving. You ready for that? Rail didn't hesitate. He nodded once. Vance felt a strange sense of pride at the boy's courage. He had only known Rail for a few minutes, but something inside him already recognized the truth. This was his son. He tapped his comm again. Hayes, prep the Black Star. We're leaving. The Black Star was a prototype stealth ship, one of Earth's most advanced vessels. It was fast, equipped with top-tier cloaking tech, and most importantly, untraceable. If they could make it off the station, they had a chance. But leaving wouldn't be easy. The hangar doors burst open as armed fleet security officers stormed in, weapons raised. Captain Vance. The lead officer stepped forward, his face grim. Orders from command. The Kavar want the hybrid. We are to detain the alien and turn over the child. Vance's blood ran cold. His own people were following orders. Orders that meant handing over his son to be executed. Jaira shifted beside him, her muscles tensed. She was ready to fight. Always ready. But Vance knew that killing humans, even those following terrible orders, was not the answer. He had to think fast. He stepped forward, his posture calm but commanding. Lieutenant, stand down. The officer hesitated. "Sir, I have my orders." Vance's voice turned cold. "And I am your superior officer. I am taking the child into protective custody. If you want to challenge that, you'll be answering to me and to Fleet Command." The officer swallowed hard. Vance's reputation was well known, a decorated war hero, one of the best captains in the fleet. No one wanted to challenge him directly. The officer lowered his weapon. "Understood, sir." He stepped aside, but his expression was clear. This isn't over. Vance wasted no time. He motioned for Jaira and Rail to move. Together, they sprinted toward the docking bay where the Black Star waited. The station shook as the first K-VAR attack struck the outer shields. They were out of time. Vance tapped his comm. "Hayes, open the launch bay. We're coming in hot." "Understood, Captain. Engines are primed and ready." The trio raced through the corridors, alarms blaring around them. Behind them, fleet officers were regrouping, likely receiving new orders to stop them. Vance wasn't going to let that happen. As they rounded a corner, a squad of security personnel blocked their path. Jaira didn't wait. She moved like lightning. In one smooth motion, she launched forward, disarming the nearest officer with a brutal strike. Before anyone could react, she twisted another guard's rifle out of his hands and tossed it to Vance. Vance caught the weapon, flipping it to stun mode. He fired 2 quick shots, knocking out the remaining officers before they could raise their weapons. Rail watched, wide-eyed. "Keep moving," Vance ordered. They reached the Black Star just as explosions rocked the station. The shields were failing. Hayes was already in the pilot's seat, her fingers flying over the controls. "Strap in, Captain. This is going to be rough." Vance pushed Rail into his seat and buckled him in. The boy gripped the harness tightly, but said nothing. He was strong, braver than any child should have to be. The hangar doors blew open as the Black Star lifted off. K-VAR warriors had breached the station. They stormed inside, weapons raised, but they were too late. Hayes punched the engines, and the Black Star shot out into space. The K-VAR warships immediately opened fire. Lasers and missiles streaked toward them, but Hayes twisted the ship into a sharp dive, narrowly dodging the incoming blasts. "Activating cloaking field," she shouted. The ship flickered and vanished as the stealth drive kicked in. Vance watched the K-VAR fleet outside the viewport. They were scanning, searching, but they couldn't see them. For now, they were safe. He turned to Rail, who was still gripping his harness, his face unreadable. Vance unbuckled and knelt in front of him. "We're safe for now," he said, "but this isn't over." Rail looked at him, his eyes filled with something Vance couldn't quite name. "They will come again," the boy said softly. Vance nodded. "Yes, but we'll be ready." Jaira crossed her arms, watching both of them. "We have only delayed the inevitable." Vance exhaled. "Then we find a way to stop it." He looked at his son. No one was going to take him away. The Black Star drifted through the endless darkness of space, hidden beneath the shimmering veil of its cloaking field. Inside, Captain Ilias Vance sat in the cockpit, staring at the stars, his mind heavy with unanswered questions. Rail, his son, sat across from him, quiet and unreadable. The boy had barely spoken since they had escaped Starbase Argus. He was strong, too strong for a child. It was unsettling. Vance glanced at Jaira, the K-VAR warrior who had brought this child into his life. She stood near the entrance of the cockpit, arms crossed, her gaze steady. "Where do we go now?" Hayes asked from the pilot's seat, her fingers resting lightly on the controls. Vance exhaled. That was the question, wasn't it? They had nowhere to run. The K-VAR would never stop hunting Rail, and now neither would the fleet. The only way out was to fight. But how do you fight an enemy that never stops coming? Jaira spoke first. "There is one place." Vance turned to her. "Where?" She hesitated. "A hidden K-VAR outpost. One that no one knows about." Vance frowned. Why would we go there? Jaira's violet eyes darkened. Because it is the only place where Rael can learn what he is. The words made Vance's stomach tighten. He looked at Rael, who sat still, his hands clenched into fists. You want to train him? Vance asked. Jaira nodded. He is strong, but strength alone is not enough. If he is to survive, he must understand who he is, what he can do. Vance studied the boy. He didn't look afraid. If anything, he seemed eager. Rael met his gaze. I want to learn. Vance hesitated. This was happening too fast. He had just learned about the boy's existence, and now they were talking about training him as a warrior. But did they have a choice? He sighed. All right. Where is this outpost? Jaira moved to the control panel, pressing a series of buttons. A holographic map of the sector appeared. She pointed to a distant system, far beyond human-controlled space. Here, the world of Kareth. Vance studied the map. The system was deep in Kvar territory, but it was remote, a forgotten world, far from the war. How do you know it's safe? He asked. Jaira smirked. Because I built it. Vance raised an eyebrow. That's concerning. Jaira's expression didn't change. We don't have another option. Vance exhaled, rubbing his temples. Hayes, set a course for Kareth. Hayes hesitated but nodded. Course set. Estimated time. 6 hours. Vance turned back to Rael. Get some rest, kid. Rael didn't move. I don't need rest. Vance sighed. Of course he didn't. Jaira knelt beside the boy. Come. Rael hesitated, then stood. Together, they walked toward the training chamber. Vance watched them go, a strange feeling in his chest. Was this what it meant to be a father? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Rael face this alone. Hours later, the attack. The Black Star was halfway to Kareth when the alarms blared. Warning. Multiple vessels approaching. Vance shot up from his seat, eyes snapping to the control panel. Hayes swore under her breath. They found us. The cloaking field had kept them hidden, but the Kvar had sent search ships. And now they were here. Vance tapped the comm. Jaira, get up here. Now. Seconds later, Jaira and Rael entered the cockpit. The display showed 3 Kvar hunter ships, moving fast. Vance clenched his fists. They weren't trying to disable them. They were coming for the kill. Evasive maneuvers, he ordered. Hayes pushed the controls, and the Black Star veered sharply, dodging the first volley of plasma fire. Jaira narrowed her eyes. They won't stop. Vance gritted his teeth. Then we make them stop. He turned to Rael. Kid, you ever see a starship battle before? Rael shook his head. Vance smiled grimly. Then watched closely. He took the gunnery controls, his fingers moving over the targeting system. The Kvar ships fired again, their energy beams slicing through space. Vance twisted the ship to the left, avoiding most of the fire, but a blast grazed the hull, sending a shudder through the ship. Shields at 60%, Hayes reported. Vance locked onto the nearest enemy ship. Let's see how they like this. He pressed the trigger, and the Black Star's plasma cannons roared to life. The first blast struck the Kvar ship's engines. The second blew it apart. 1 down, 2 to go. Jaira smirked. Not bad. Vance smirked back. I try. The remaining ships circled around, trying to flank them. Jaira tapped the control panel. I have an idea. She adjusted the ship's power distribution, diverting energy to the rear thrusters. Hold on, she warned. Then she cut the engines. For a split second, the Black Star seemed to drift, as if disabled. The enemy ships took the bait, moving in for the kill. And that's when Jaira fired the reverse thrusters. The sudden burst of energy threw them backward, past the enemy ships, now exposing their unprotected flanks. Vance didn't hesitate. He fired. Both Kiver ships exploded in a flash of fire and metal. Silence filled the cockpit. Then Hayes laughed. "Remind me never to doubt you too." Vance smirked, turning to Rail. "Lesson number 1, kid. Always fight smarter." Rail stared at him, eyes wide with admiration. Then he nodded. "I understand." Vance felt something warm in his chest. For the first time, he saw it. Rail wasn't just a child. He was his son. And no matter what came next, Vance would protect him. At any cost. The Black Star soared through the endless void, leaving the wreckage of the Kivar hunter ships behind. The battle was over, but Captain Elias Vance knew it was only the beginning. The Kivar wouldn't stop. They would keep hunting Rail until he was dead. Vance turned to the boy, who sat silently beside him in the cockpit. His dark eyes were focused on the swirling stars outside, his small hands resting on his knees. Rail had barely spoken since the fight, but Vance had seen something in his expression. A spark. The boy had watched the battle closely, studying every move. Vance had no doubt. Rail was learning, and that both reassured and terrified him. The Forgotten World. The ship's control panel beeped as Kareth appeared on the scanners, a small forgotten planet hidden in the farthest reaches of Kivar space. Vance studied the readings. The planet was covered in vast deserts, jagged mountains, and thick forests. A harsh world. A warrior's world. Jaira leaned forward, pointing at a location on the map. "There. That's the outpost." Vance nodded. "Hayes, take us in." The Black Star descended through the planet's atmosphere, cutting through swirling dust storms. The ride was rough, but Hayes kept the ship steady as they approached a hidden valley, surrounded by towering cliffs. And then Vance saw it, a massive structure built into the rocks. The outpost was ancient, a fortress of black stone and steel, a forgotten Kivar stronghold. As they landed, Vance turned to Rail. "Ready?" The boy met his gaze. "Yes." The trial begins. The moment they stepped outside, the heat hit them. The air was dry, the wind carrying sand across the rocky ground. Jaira led the way toward the fortress. As they approached, the massive doors rumbled open, revealing a group of Kivar warriors waiting inside. Vance tensed, his hand hovering over his weapon. The warriors were tall and imposing, their armor gleaming under the dim light of the torches that lined the hall. One of them, a broad-shouldered warrior with deep scars across his face, stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Jaira. "You return." His voice was deep, filled with suspicion. Jaira nodded. "I bring the child." The warrior's gaze shifted to Rail. His expression darkened. Half-blood. Vance clenched his fists. He didn't like the tone of that. Rail, however, didn't flinch. The warrior studied him for a long moment, then turned to Jaira. "If he is to stay, he must prove himself." Jaira nodded, as if she expected this. "I know." Vance frowned. "What kind of test?" The warrior smirked. "A trial. If he survives, he stays." Vance's blood ran cold. "And if he fails?" The warrior shrugged. "Then he dies." "Absolutely not." Vance stepped in front of Rail. "He's just a child." Jaira's voice was calm but firm. "This is the way of my people." Vance turned to her, disbelief in his eyes. "And if he doesn't survive?" Jaira didn't look away. "Then he was never meant to." Silence filled the air. Vance's mind raced. He wanted to argue, to fight. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just about survival. It was about who Rail was meant to become. Vance knelt in front of the boy, gripping his shoulders. "You don't have to do this." Rail looked at him with steady eyes. "Yes, I do." And in that moment, Vance understood. His son was not afraid. Rail wasn't running. He was ready to face whatever came next. Vance swallowed hard, then slowly nodded. "Then I'll be right here." Rail gave a small nod, then turned to face the warriors. The trial had begun. The first trial. Rael was led deep into the fortress, where an underground arena awaited. The warriors surrounded the stone circle, watching silently. In the center stood a massive creature, a Kivar beast, its 4 eyes glowing in the dim light. Its thick hide was covered in scars, and its sharp claws gleamed. Jaira spoke, her voice cold. "Defeat the beast, or die." Vance clenched his fists. This was madness. But Rael didn't move. Instead, he stared at the beast, his small body tense but calm. The creature growled and charged. The moment it lunged, Rael dodged, moving faster than Vance expected. The beast's claws slashed the air where he had just been standing. Rael spun, his movements precise, controlled. The warriors watched in silence. Vance held his breath. Rael wasn't fighting with brute strength. He was thinking, watching, learning. And then, suddenly, he moved. With speed that wasn't natural, Rael leaped onto the beast's back. Before it could throw him off, he grabbed its throat and a flash of energy burst from his hands. The beast shuddered, then collapsed. The arena fell into stunned silence. Vance's heart pounded. What had he just seen? Rael stood over the fallen creature, his small chest rising and falling. His eyes glowed faintly. Jaira stepped forward, a satisfied smirk on her face. "He has passed." The warriors murmured among themselves. Vance, however, was still staring at his son. Rael turned to him, something unreadable in his expression. For the first time, Vance saw it. Rael wasn't just a child. He was something more, something dangerous. And the universe had no idea what was coming. The underground arena was silent, the only sound the slow, heavy breathing of the fallen beast. Its massive body lay motionless, defeated not by brute force, but by something far more terrifying. Rael stood over it, his small hands clenched into fists. His dark eyes glowed faintly before the strange energy within him faded. Captain Elias Vance watched, his heart pounding. What had just happened? The Kivar warriors stood in stunned silence. Even Jaira, who had trained among them, looked impressed. Then, the warrior who had challenged Rael earlier stepped forward. He passed the first trial. His voice was quiet but firm. But it is only the beginning. Rael turned to face him, showing no fear. Vance wanted to protest. How much more would they put his son through? But something in Rael's posture stopped him. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. And Vance knew, deep in his heart, this was his path. The next challenge. The warriors led Rael deeper into the fortress. Vance followed closely, his fists clenched. He hated this, hated standing back while his son was forced into these brutal tests. But Jaira placed a hand on his shoulder. "You cannot protect him from this," she said softly. "He must become strong, stronger than anyone." Vance exhaled sharply but said nothing. The warriors entered a dark chamber, a massive hall filled with towering pillars of black stone. Strange symbols glowed faintly on the walls, ancient and unreadable. In the center of the room stood a pedestal. On it rested a blade, long and curved, made of a dark metal that seemed to drink in the light. One of the warriors stepped forward. "This is the blade of Kareth." His voice echoed in the chamber. "It is said that only those with the blood of warriors may wield it." Vance frowned. "And what happens if he tries?" The warrior smirked. "If he is unworthy, the blade will reject him." Vance's stomach twisted. He didn't like the sound of that. Rael, however, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and reached out. The moment his fingers touched the hilt, a shockwave of energy blasted through the chamber. Vance stumbled back as the pillars trembled. The glowing symbols on the walls flared to life, pulsing with power. Rael's body shook, his eyes wide as raw energy surged through him. For a moment, Vance thought the blade was destroying him. But then, Rael gritted his teeth and held on. The energy swirled around him, growing brighter and brighter, until suddenly it vanished, and Rael stood there, the blade in his hand. The warriors stared in shock. One of them whispered, "Impossible." Vance exhaled, his heart pounding. His son had done the impossible. Again. The truth revealed. Rael turned to face them, the blade resting easily in his grip. It should have been too large for him, but it wasn't. It fit him perfectly, as if it had been made for him. Jaira stepped forward, her violet eyes filled with something Vance had never seen before. Reverence. "The prophecy," she murmured. Vance narrowed his eyes. "What prophecy?" The lead warrior, the one with the scared face, stepped closer. His voice was low, almost reluctant. Long ago, it was foretold that a child of two bloodlines would rise. He pointed to Rael, a child born of human and Kivar, a warrior of both worlds. Vance's chest tightened. "You think Rael is that child?" The warrior's gaze was unreadable. "The blade does not lie." Vance looked at Rael, who stood silently, his small hand still gripping the weapon. Was this what Jaira had meant when she said Rael was special? Had she known all along? Vance turned to her. "You knew, didn't you?" She hesitated before answering. "I suspected." Vance's jaw tightened. He didn't like being kept in the dark. But before he could say anything else, an alarm suddenly blared through the chamber. "Intudd or as DTTTED." Vance's instincts kicked in immediately. "We've been found." Jaira's eyes flashed. The Kivar hunters. The warriors grabbed their weapons, their expressions turning grim. Vance pulled out his pistol. "Hayes, report." He barked into his comm. Her voice crackled through the speaker. "We've got multiple ships inbound. They're coming in fast." Vance swore under his breath. They weren't ready for a fight. Not here. Not now. The lead warrior turned to Rael. "The time for trials is over. Now, you must prove yourself in battle." Vance clenched his fists. His son had been forced into enough fights. But Rael only nodded, his grip tightening on the blade. And for the first time, Vance saw it in his eyes. Not just determination, not just strength, but purpose. His son was ready. And this time, Vance wouldn't try to stop him. The battle begins. Outside, the Black Star's engines roared as Hayes prepared for an emergency takeoff. But the enemy ships were already landing. Vance stood at the entrance of the fortress, his pulse steady. He had fought battles before. But this time, it was different. This time, Rael stood beside him. The Kivar hunters emerged from the dust, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. They had come to kill Rael. But they had made one mistake. They had underestimated him. Rael lifted the blade, his small figure bathed in the red glow of the setting sun. The hunters rushed forward, and Rael charged to meet them. The warrior had awakened, and the universe would never be the same. The sky above Kerith burned with fire as enemy ships descended like hunting beasts. Their engines roared, sending waves of dust and sand swirling across the valley. Captain Elias Vance stood at the entrance of the fortress, gripping his blaster tightly. Beside him, Rael held the blade of Kerith, its dark metal humming with strange energy. The Kivar hunters had come. They had chased Rael across the stars, determined to destroy him. But now he would not run. He would fight. The battle begins. The Kivar hunters move swiftly, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. Their leader, a towering warrior clad in black armor, stepped forward. "The child must die," he declared, his voice cold. "Surrender him, and we will spare the rest of you." Vance's jaw tightened. Not happening. Jaira, standing beside him, drew her twin blades. "If you want him, you'll have to get through us." The leader's eyes narrowed. "So be it." With a sharp motion of his hand, the hunters attacked. Blaster fire lit up the battlefield. Warriors clashed in the dust, blades sparking as they met in furious combat. Vance fought with the skill of a soldier, moving quickly and taking down enemies with precise shots. Jaira was like a storm, spinning and cutting through the enemy ranks with deadly grace. But the real battle belonged to Rael. Rael's power unleashed. The first K'varr warrior lunged at him. Rael dodged, his small body moving faster than the eye could follow. With one swift motion, he slashed the blade across the warrior's armor. A shockwave of blue energy erupted, sending the enemy flying backward. Another attacker came from behind, but Rael sensed him. Without looking, he spun and blocked the strike, his blade meeting the enemy's weapon with a sharp clang. Vance saw it all happening. His son wasn't just fighting, he was thinking, adapting, controlling the battlefield. The K'varr leader growled in frustration. "Enough," he roared. He raised his hands, and suddenly a wave of dark energy shot toward Rael. Vance's heart stopped. "Rael, move." But Rael didn't run. Instead, he lifted his hand. And for the first time, the strange energy within him responded. A glowing shield of pure force erupted around him, blocking the attack. The energy crackled, then shot back at the enemy, knocking him to the ground. Silence fell across the battlefield. The K'varr warriors stared in shock. Vance felt his breath catch. What had his son just done? Rael turned to face the K'varr leader. His eyes glowed faintly, filled with something ancient and powerful. "I am not afraid of you." His voice was steady, filled with quiet strength, "and I will not run anymore." The leader's expression darkened. He charged, raising his weapon. But Rael was faster. With one final strike, his blade cut through the air. And the leader fell. The remaining K'varr warriors froze. Without their leader, their fight was lost. One by one, they retreated into the shadows, disappearing into their ships. Within moments, the battlefield fell silent. The war was over, and Rael had won. The future awaits. As the dust settled, Vance approached his son. Rael still held the blade of Kereth, but the glow in his eyes had faded. He looked up at his father, his expression unreadable. Vance knelt, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did good, kid." Rael hesitated. "Am I a warrior now?" Jaira stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "You are more than that, Rael. You are something new." The warriors of the fortress bowed their heads in respect. They had come to test the boy. Instead, they had witnessed the birth of a legend. Vance exhaled, looking at the burning horizon. "What now?" Jaira smiled. "Now we prepare. The K'varr will not stop hunting him. But he is no longer alone." Rael nodded, gripping his blade tightly. He had a father. He had allies. He had a destiny. And as the black star lifted off, carrying them toward the stars, he knew his journey was only just beginning.